In July of 1998, nestled deep in the hills of northern Vermont, the Honeysuckle Grand Hotel welcomed two guests who would forever change its history. Lorna Reeve, 27, a preschool teacher from upstate New York, had just married Daniel Reeve, a 32-year-old insurance adjuster from New Hampshire. They'd met through friends, fallen quickly into something that looked like love, and decided to marry just 8 months after their first date. Their honeymoon was meant to be a quiet escape. The hotel, once a grand destination in the 1920s, had aged into something more intimate: low ceilings, creaky floors, walls that held too much silence. The Reeves checked into room 306, a corner suite on the third floor overlooking a grove of black pines and a disused tennis court covered in moss. For 2 days, staff described the couple as normal, not overly affectionate, but not cold. They kept to themselves, ordered room service once, took a walk down the gravel trail behind the hotel. No one remembered anything unusual. But early on the morning of the third day, everything changed. Daniel Reeve came down to the front desk around 9:15 a.m., visibly shaken. He asked if anyone had seen his wife, said she'd gone out early for coffee, maybe walked into town, but she hadn't come back. He was calm at first, even apologetic for bothering anyone. But by mid-morning, he was pacing the lobby, repeating her name to anyone who would listen, asking staff and guests if they'd seen a red-haired woman in a blue sundress. By 1 p.m., hotel staff called the local police. Officers arrived shortly after and interviewed Daniel in the hotel lounge. He explained that Lorna had woken up early, said she wanted fresh air and a decent espresso, something the hotel couldn't offer. She left, he said, without her purse, but with her room key. He hadn't seen her since. Officers checked the surrounding streets and asked nearby diners, gas stations, even a small bookstore in town. No one had seen her. No one fitting her description had passed through. The only local cafe opened at 10 that morning, and the manager swore no red-haired woman had come in. Her name didn't appear on any receipts. She wasn't caught on any public-facing security footage. It was as if Lorna Reeve had simply vanished. When detectives requested the hotel's internal security footage, they ran into their first real roadblock. The manager, an older man named Calvin Hartley, said the security system wasn't functioning properly that week due to a summer lightning storm that had knocked out several cameras. Only one hallway camera, pointing toward the stairwell on the second floor, had been operational. Room 306's hallway camera, if it ever existed, was never found. No footage showed Lorna leaving the room. None showed her walking down the stairs or into the lobby. According to the building's layout, she would have had to pass at least one camera to exit the hotel, but she didn't. The hotel had only one entrance open at that time in the morning, right by the front desk. No one recalled seeing her come through it. Her belongings remained in the room, her suitcase untouched, her purse, keys, wallet, all neatly placed on the dresser. Her toothbrush was dry, her bed made. Nothing indicated she'd been preparing to leave. There were no signs of a struggle. The room was clean. Almost too clean. An officer noted that the carpet near the bathroom had recently been scrubbed, but didn't think much of it at the time. Daniel's behavior grew increasingly erratic over the next few hours. He wept. He yelled. He insisted they search the woods behind the hotel. And they did. Officers, volunteers, and dogs combed the nearby trails. Nothing. By sundown, Lorna Reeve was classified as a missing person. Flyers went up, news crews arrived, and room 306 was sealed for investigation, though there was little forensics could find. No blood, no prints, nothing suspicious. Daniel stayed 2 more nights in a different room, claiming he couldn't bear to leave without her. But some of the hotel staff quietly told police they felt uneasy around him. He had a way of speaking about her in the past tense, of explaining things before he was asked. There was no proof of wrongdoing, but something didn't sit right. Still, without a body, without any sign of foul play, there was no arrest, no charges, no real trail to follow. Just a young woman who walked out of her hotel room and never returned. A husband with more questions than answers, and a hotel room that would carry a secret for the next 25 years. When Daniel Reeve appeared on local television 2 days after his wife vanished, he looked hollowed out, as if sleep had abandoned him. His hands trembled slightly as he held up a photo of Lorna at their wedding reception, her red hair pinned loosely, the smile just a little off-center, like she wasn't used to cameras. He spoke softly, asking anyone with information to please come forward. He said she might have gotten lost, might have fallen, might be wandering around disoriented. He pleaded. He paused. At times he couldn't seem to find words. Viewers saw a devastated husband, a man blindsided, but not everyone watching believed it. Lorna's older sister, Valerie, drove up from Poughkeepsie the morning after the news broke. She went straight to the Honeysuckle Grand and waited for the detectives to return from the woods. In her own words, she knew something was off the moment she saw Daniel. He hugged her, but the embrace was stiff, mechanical. He didn't cry. He didn't ask what she thought they should do. He just kept repeating that Lorna must have left early and was probably still out there. Valerie asked him how Lorna had left without her purse, without her shoes, without so much as brushing her hair. He didn't answer. Detectives took her statement that afternoon. She told them Lorna had second-guessed the marriage almost immediately after the wedding, that she'd called her just a week before the honeymoon, saying Daniel had become possessive. He checked her phone, got jealous if she spoke to male coworkers, and once accused her of being too friendly with a waiter during dinner. Lorna had told Valerie she felt trapped, but also embarrassed to back out after planning the wedding so publicly. Valerie hadn't thought she was in danger, but now she couldn't stop replaying every phone call, every moment she might have missed something. Detectives circled back to Daniel for a second interview. He stuck to his original story. Lorna had woken up around 6, kissed him on the shoulder, and said she was going to find coffee. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. He said he stayed in bed until close to 9, then noticed she wasn't back. He showered, got dressed, and went downstairs. The inconsistencies started to show when they checked the timeline. Daniel had told the hotel staff he woke at 8, but in the interview, he said 6. There was no record of anyone ordering coffee that morning from the front desk or requesting a local cafe recommendation. No other guests saw Lorna leave, and the nearest coffee shop didn't open until 10. Still, there was no physical evidence to contradict him, no signs of a struggle, no screaming heard, no blood, just silence. And Daniel's grief, which to most onlookers seemed authentic. He stayed in Vermont for another week, doing interviews, walking the hotel grounds, standing at the edge of the woods like he was waiting for her to come walking out. Reporters started referring to him as the grieving husband, and he played the part well. But behind the scenes, Valerie wasn't convinced. She noticed how quickly Daniel shut down any mention of Lorna's doubts, how he corrected her in front of officers, how he told people Lorna had wandered off when her history showed she was cautious, anxious even, about remote places. 3 days after Lorna's disappearance, a family friend brought up the couple's brief separation just months before the wedding. Lorna had moved out for 2 weeks after an argument. The reason? Daniel had punched a hole in the bathroom door during a fight. Lorna's parents never knew about it. She'd told Valerie, swore it was the only time, and moved back in. Now, detectives made note of it, but again, without a body, without a confession. It wasn't enough. They couldn't build a case on a hole in a wall and had a bad feeling. Daniel eventually returned home to New Hampshire. His last interview outside the hotel aired a few days later. He looked tired, shaky. He thanked law enforcement, said he still believed Lorna was alive, and asked for privacy. Then he left. Alone. Valerie stood outside room 306 that same night and whispered into the dark hallway, "She didn't walk out of here. Someone helped her disappear." The door to the room had already been repainted. Daniel Reeves' first televised interview aired 2 nights after Lorna vanished. He sat on the edge of a hotel armchair in a wrinkled collared shirt, staring just off camera with swollen eyes and a dry mouth that kept trying to form words. He talked about her laugh, about how excited she'd been for their honeymoon, about how maybe she'd gotten turned around in the woods behind the hotel, or maybe had a fall somewhere along the gravel trail they'd walked the day before. He stopped himself halfway through a sentence, looked down, and went silent for nearly 20 seconds before the reporter gently moved on. He didn't ask for attention, didn't lash out at police or the hotel staff. He just looked tired. To many watching, he looked like a man unraveling. But not everyone saw grief. Lorna's sister Valerie watched from her parents' home in Poughkeepsie and felt a coldness that she couldn't explain. There was something in the way he said her name, something in how he never once said he believed she was still alive. Not on camera, not on the phone. He kept saying, "I don't understand how she could just be gone," like he was already adjusting to her absence. Valerie had spoken to Lorna just 4 days before the wedding. She remembered that phone call clearly because her sister's voice had been different, tight, like she was walking on eggshells in her own apartment. Lorna had admitted she'd had second thoughts, but said Daniel had promised to change, that the outbursts were just stress, that she wanted to believe him. Now, standing outside room 306 with police tape flapping in the wind, Valerie didn't believe a word of it. She asked to go into the room, but was told the investigation was still active. She wasn't allowed past the door. Still, she noticed something strange. The hallway outside smelled faintly of bleach, only in that corner, nowhere else. Daniel stayed at the hotel 3 more days after Lorna's disappearance. He gave multiple interviews, cooperated with police, and joined a volunteer search party that combed the woods for 6 hours. Several officers later said they'd never seen someone so composed. He answered every question, never got defensive, never raised his voice, and yet something about his demeanor felt hollow, like he was following a script, like he was trying to remember the right order of emotions. One detective, off the record, admitted they couldn't tell if he was grieving or acting out what he thought grief was supposed to look like. When police asked Daniel why Lorna left without her purse, he said she just wanted coffee and fresh air, that she didn't take things when she went on short walks. But her phone, wallet, room key, and shoes were all left behind. It didn't make sense. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication anyone else had entered the room, no struggle, and still no footage of her leaving. When pressed, Daniel offered one more theory. Maybe she'd had a breakdown. Maybe she walked away on purpose, but Valerie rejected that immediately. Lorna had anxiety, yes, but she wasn't impulsive. She didn't wander off. She didn't leave things undone. As investigators pieced together a timeline, inconsistencies began to surface. Daniel initially claimed they had slept in late and that Lorna left around 8:30 a.m., but the hotel's breakfast log showed Daniel alone in the dining room at 7:10, wearing the same clothes from the night before. He said he didn't remember eating. When asked why he didn't report her missing until almost 9:30, he said he thought she was in the shower, that he hadn't checked the bathroom. But when officers entered the room, the towels were dry, and the bathroom mirror was spotless. No condensation, no fingerprints. None of it was damning, not yet, but it built a shape, one that looked less like a disappearance and more like a story being carefully managed. The problem was, without physical evidence, detectives were left with instinct, and instinct doesn't hold up in court. So they waited, they watched, and they hoped something would slip. Daniel left Vermont 10 days after Lorna vanished. Before he left, he stopped by the local station one final time and handed officers a box of photos from their honeymoon, most of them taken in the first 2 days. He said he wanted them to have everything. As he left, an officer asked if he wanted to say anything else on record. He paused, then said, "I don't think she's coming back," and walked out the door. Valerie stood alone in the hallway later that night, just outside room 306, and whispered her sister's name into the empty corridor. She said it didn't echo. It just stopped, like the room swallowed it whole. The Honeysuckle Grand had stood for nearly a century by the time Lorna Reeve disappeared inside it. Built in 1924, it was once a seasonal escape for wealthy New Englanders, known for its deep clawfoot tubs, antique chandeliers, and wraparound porches that faced miles of pine forest. But by the late 1990s, the hotel had slipped into a different chapter. Faded wallpaper, mismatched furniture, and a rotating staff made up of college kids and retirees. Still, it was charming in the way that nostalgia sometimes masks neglect. For investigators, though, charm didn't matter. They needed answers, and the building itself wasn't offering any. From the moment detectives began canvassing the hotel, they noticed an unusual level of defensiveness. The manager, Calvin Hartley, had worked there for over 30 years. On paper, he should have been helpful, familiar with the layout, the protocols, the staff. But when asked about security tapes, Hartley claimed they weren't available. A storm the week before had damaged the system, he said. Power outages, electrical surges. The tapes from the hallway near room 306 had been erased, or maybe never recorded at all. He gave inconsistent versions to different officers. One detective asked to see the footage from the main entrance camera instead. Hartley hesitated, then said that camera had been down too. They were in the process of upgrading the whole system. Nothing had been backed up. The staff followed his lead. Housekeepers offered vague timelines. Front desk workers couldn't recall if they'd seen Lorna leave that morning. One bellhop said he might have passed her in the hallway the previous day, but couldn't say which floor. Another said he was pretty sure he saw Daniel carrying something to the utility closet on the 3rd floor, but when pressed, changed his answer and said he was mistaken. It became clear that everyone was watching what they said, and who might be listening. There was one exception. A young maid named Teresa Coyle, just 19, told a patrol officer during an early sweep that she had heard yelling from room 306 around midnight the night before Lorna vanished. She hadn't seen anything, but she remembered the sound, a woman's voice, sharp, followed by something heavy falling. She assumed it was a couple arguing and didn't report it. Her name appeared in one field note but was never added to the official list of witnesses. When detectives returned to interview her formally, she was no longer employed at the hotel. Calvin Hartley claimed she had quit suddenly and didn't have forwarding information. Within 5 days of the disappearance, the hotel changed the locks on room 306. When detectives asked why, Hartley said it was routine, a precaution, but it wasn't. Standard policy dictated waiting until the investigation cleared the room, and before investigators could return for a second sweep, the room had been repainted. The original pale green walls were now a neutral cream. The carpet, originally a deep red, had been professionally cleaned. When asked who authorized the renovation, Hartley shrugged and said, "It needed to be done anyway." What detectives couldn't say out loud, at least not yet, was that the hotel's cooperation had gone from passive to obstructive. Requests for maintenance logs were delayed. The staff lawyered up. An anonymous tip came in from a former front desk employee who claimed Hartley had quietly instructed the overnight team to scrub any non-essential security files before police arrived. There was no proof, just silence. The kind of silence that spreads through a building like smoke, visible only after the damage is done. Still, none of it was enough to act on. The building had no history of serious complaints, no record of misconduct. And without a body or a crime scene, or even a confirmed time of disappearance, the case remained suspended in ambiguity. Investigators kept coming back to the same question. How could a woman vanish from a locked room with no witnesses, no footage, and no trace? And how could so many people who worked just feet away from that room remember so little? One officer would later describe it this way. It wasn't that the hotel was hiding something obvious. It was that every door they tried seemed already closed. Every log is overwritten, every voice rehearsed, like the walls had already absorbed the secret and refused to let it out. By the 3rd week, investigators had combed through every receipt, call log, and guest registry the Honeysuckle Grand had to offer. The details weren't damning on their own, but they didn't sit right. There was a lunch charge to room 306 at 1:17 p.m. on the day Lorna vanished, 2 sandwiches and a Diet Coke, delivered by room service. Daniel had told police he hadn't eaten all day and said he'd been too anxious to eat. When asked again about the charge, he claimed it must have been a mistake, that maybe he'd ordered and then forgot. But the tray had been cleared by staff that same evening, and both plates had been scraped clean. In another receipt dated the night before her disappearance, a bar tab showed 3 drinks, even though Daniel told officers they had gone to bed early and hadn't left the room after dinner. There were time gaps, too. Daniel said he had woken around 8 a.m. and noticed Lorna was gone, but the night concierge remembered seeing him coming downstairs around 6:45 a.m., already dressed, standing by the lobby windows for nearly half an hour before anyone else had come down. Surveillance footage, what little survived, didn't show Lorna at all, not in the elevator, not in the lobby, not outside. It was as if she never left the room, and without proof that she ever did, suspicions began to tighten around the man who said she had. But suspicion wasn't enough. The carpet in room 306 had been cleaned before the forensic team arrived. The bathroom was spotless. The mattress showed no signs of struggle, no blood, no damage. It was as if she had vanished into the air. And when there's no crime scene, no confession, and no body, a case like this can only lean so far before it collapses under its own weight. Officers kept circling back to Daniel, pressing lightly, waiting for a slip. But each time he offered less. Fewer words, fewer details, and then nothing. 26 days after Lorna was reported missing, Daniel Reeve quietly left Vermont. No press release, no final plea. Just a phone call to detectives saying he was heading back to New Hampshire. He said he couldn't keep living out of a suitcase. He said he had to get back to work. Valerie called it abandonment. The lead investigator called it self-preservation. Either way, he was gone. Back home, Daniel refused further contact. He declined a second formal interview, citing emotional distress. He stopped returning Valerie's calls entirely. The few people who stayed in touch with him described a man trying to move on. He went back to his job, stopped talking about Lorna, and avoided news coverage. He never filed any lawsuit against the hotel, never posted a missing persons ad again. By the following summer, the case had gone cold. But Lorna's family didn't let it rest. Valerie sent letters to the state attorney's office. She hounded detectives for updates. She started keeping a binder of every article, every theory, every piece of paper with Lorna's name on it. Her parents quietly hired a private investigator who found nothing the police hadn't already tried. The months dragged on, leads slowed, and one by one, reporters moved on to other stories. 4 years later, Daniel remarried. The ceremony was private, small, in a rural chapel just outside Concord. His new wife was a woman he'd met through work. There were no announcements in local papers, no interviews. When news reached Lorna's family, Valerie didn't speak for a full day. Later that week, she called the original lead detective and left a message that simply said, "He's moved on, but we haven't." Then she hung up. The case file was boxed and stored in a back room of the county precinct. It sat beside other cold files, dusty, unresolved, and largely forgotten. What remained wasn't enough for charges, wasn't enough for closure, only questions, and a growing, unshakable feeling shared by nearly everyone who had worked the case that the truth had never left the Honeysuckle Grand. It had only been covered up, quietly, carefully, and completely. Over the years, room 306 never shook its shadow. On paper, it was just another corner suite with a dated bathroom and a view of the tennis courts that no one used anymore. But among guests, it carried a reputation. A woman from Boston checked in during the spring of 2001 and left before sunrise the next morning. She told the night clerk she'd heard muffled crying coming from inside the wall behind the headboard. At first, she thought it was another guest in the adjoining room. But when she called the front desk to complain, they told her the suite next door was empty. Maintenance staff searched, found nothing, and wrote it off as water pipes. But the woman never asked for a refund. She just wanted out. Stories like that began to trickle in every year. In 2004, a family from Pennsylvania stayed for 3 nights while visiting relatives nearby. Their 8-year-old son refused to sleep in the bedroom. On the second night, he told his parents a lady with red hair was sitting in the closet, staring at him without moving. His parents assumed it was a nightmare until he repeated the same description the next morning, word for word, and begged to be moved. By the time they checked out, the front desk had logged the incident as child's imagination. But housekeeping later reported that the boy's blankets had been pulled into the center of the floor, though neither parent remembered him doing it. By 2007, the complaints had a pattern. Guests described voices in the night, the sensation of being watched, shadows that stretched across the room in unnatural ways. Some described the sound of fingernails dragging along the inside of the bathroom wall. One guest, a businessman traveling alone, called the front desk at 2 a.m., insisting someone was trying to break into his room through the vent above the shower. Security checked. No one was there. The man checked out the following morning without finishing his stay. He never left a review, never returned. The hotel's management responded quietly. They stopped assigning room 306 unless every other suite was full. Staff members who worked there long enough understood why, though they rarely said it out loud. Calvin Hartley, the longtime manager, told employees to handle complaints with discretion. Guests were offered new rooms, free breakfast, sometimes partial refunds, but nothing more. Hartley himself avoided discussing the room's history. When asked about it directly by a journalist in 2010, he said, "All old hotels have their quirks," and that was the end of it. Yet the rumors spread. Local teenagers dared each other to sneak up to the third floor and knock on the door. Wedding guests whispered about it in the lobby. Some staff admitted off the record that they refused to clean the suite alone. One housekeeper described finding the closet light on multiple times after she was sure she had turned it off. Another swore she heard someone whisper her name while she vacuumed the carpet, even though the door had been locked behind her. These stories never made it into official reports. They stayed buried in staff gossip, sealed behind professional smiles. For families like Lorna's, it was torture. Valerie heard about the story secondhand through friends of friends, and every rumor added weight to her belief that her sister had never really left the hotel. She called detectives more than once, asking if they'd heard about the voices in the walls. They told her stories weren't evidence. They couldn't reopen a case on hearsay and ghost tales. She understood, but it never stopped her from wondering. If guests kept hearing something in that room, what did it mean had been left behind? The Honeysuckle Grand itself carried on. It shifted owners twice, updated its marketing, leaned into the nostalgia of its Prohibition-era architecture. But room 306 remained the same, tucked away at the end of a hallway few guests bothered to notice. It was never closed, never sealed off, just quietly avoided it. The key sat in the same drawer behind the front desk for years at a time, gathering dust until someone new asked for a late-night room, and management had no choice but to hand it over. And almost every time, within hours or days, the guest wanted out. By the second decade after Lorna's disappearance, the room had become a secret no one wanted to name. Too many strange stories, too many unfinished nights. To outsiders, it was just superstition. To the people who worked within those walls, it was something else, something they didn't dare examine too closely, because everyone who stepped inside seemed to feel the same thing. Room 306 wasn't empty. And whatever lingered, there wasn't ready to leave. By 2021, more than 2 decades had passed since Lorna Reeves' disappearance, and her name lived mostly in yellowed clippings and fading binders stacked on the back shelves of a county records office. The case had been labeled inactive, a polite word for forgotten. But that year, the state launched a cold case unit with fresh funding, new tools, and younger investigators who hadn't lived through the original frustration. Among them was Emily Ward, a detective barely in her 30s, sharp-eyed and methodical, with a reputation for catching the details others overlooked. She was handed a stack of files on her first day. At the very top was Lorna's. Emily spent weeks combing through everything. The original statements, the receipts, the media coverage, even scraps of handwritten notes from patrol officers who had long since retired. She noticed the contradictions immediately: Daniel's shifting timeline, the suspiciously clean room, the hotel manager's vague answers. But what stood out most was what wasn't there. There had been almost no follow-up with hotel staff. The maid who reported hearing a fight had been dropped from the record. Maintenance logs weren't attached. Blueprints were never referenced. To Emily, it looked less like an investigation that had failed and more like one that had been steered off course. She requested the original building plans for the Honeysuckle Grand. The hotel had changed ownership twice since 1998, and much of its paperwork had been shuffled into storage. It took weeks of digging through archives before she found what she wanted: thick, rolled blueprints of every floor, every wing, every addition made over nearly a century of operation. She spread them across a table in the unit's offices, tracing the layouts of stairwells and closets with her pen. Room 306 caught her attention almost immediately. The plans from the 1970s showed one set of dimensions. The plans from the early 2000s showed another. The difference was subtle: a slight narrowing of the bathroom wall, a shift in where the vent should have been, almost as if space had been swallowed up by the structure itself. Emily cross-checked the dates. The renovation permit had been filed in late August of 1998, barely a month after Lorna vanished. On paper, it was described as a routine repair to fix plumbing issues on the third floor. But the timing was suspicious. Why would a hotel sink money into structural changes while still under scrutiny from investigators? Why would those changes focus specifically on the suite that had been the center of the disappearance? She searched the case notes again. Nowhere was it mentioned that the room had been altered. The police had never gone back to check. That realization lodged itself in Emily's mind and refused to move. She drove out to Vermont herself, walking the hotel's corridors as an ordinary guest. The Honeysuckle Grand was still in business, still trading on its vintage charm, though time had eroded more of its grandeur. The carpet sagged in the middle, the wallpaper peeled at the edges, but room 306 was still listed as a rentable suite. When she stepped inside, she studied the bathroom wall. To an untrained eye, it looked ordinary, but to her, the proportions were off. The wall sat too thick against the edge of the tub, as if something lay hidden inside. She paced the space, measuring it against the hallway dimensions she'd memorized. She was certain there was room unaccounted for. Emily returned to her office and filed a request for a new warrant to examine the hotel's renovations. Her colleagues were skeptical. They'd seen dozens of cold cases crumble under the weight of their own age. Witnesses dead, evidence lost, memories warped. But she argued that Lorna's case was different. The hotel had been uncooperative from the beginning. The husband's story had never lined up. And here was something physical, something measurable, that could finally justify opening the walls. She knew it was a long shot, but she also knew she couldn't let it go. What lingered with her most was how close investigators had come in 1998. The scrubbed carpets, the fast repainting, the quick renovations, they had all been right there in front of them. But without proof, suspicion had faded into silence. Now, with blueprints and permits in hand, Emily believed she'd found what everyone else had missed. Not a new theory, not a ghost story whispered by guests, but a hidden space carved into the bones of the hotel itself. A space that hadn't been there before Lorna disappeared. And as she stared at the thick black lines on the blueprints, she felt the weight of one unavoidable truth pressing down on her. Whatever happened to Lorna Reeve, the answer had been sealed inside that wall for 23 years, waiting for someone to finally open it. In the spring of 2023, the Honeysuckle Grand was once again under renovation. Ownership had changed hands yet again, this time to a development group aiming to modernize the aging property into something more appealing for weekend tourists. The plan was simple: update the plumbing, replace the outdated tiles, and rebrand the rooms with fresh paint and modern fixtures. For decades, the hotel had carried whispers of its past, but those whispers rarely made it into glossy brochures. The new owners wanted the building scrubbed of history, made clean and profitable. Contractors arrived in March, beginning on the third floor where the water pressure was weakest. Room 306 was one of the first slated for demolition. The crew working that week had no knowledge of the room's history. They didn't know about the missing bride. They didn't know about the complaints of crying in the walls or the families who checked out in the middle of the night. For them, it was just another job. By mid-morning, a pair of workers began chipping away at the old plaster along the bathroom wall, preparing to replace it with drywall. Within an hour, one of them hit something that wasn't supposed to be there. Instead of empty space, the crowbar scraped against a hard object wedged inside a pocket of hollowed-out wall. He pulled at it carefully, expecting to find debris or maybe an old tool left behind from earlier repairs. What slid out instead was a woman's shoe. White satin, aged to yellow, with a strap broken clean through. Dust fell away from the sole as he turned it over in his hands. On the inside, barely visible, was a name printed in faded ink: L. Reeve. The discovery unsettled the crew, but work continued for a few more minutes. One of them pried deeper into the cavity. This time, something smaller slid into view, a silver locket, its chain tangled, tarnished with age. Inside, under the grime, was a miniature photograph of a woman with red hair. The men stopped cold. They stepped back silent, realizing what they were pulling from the wall. But before they could process it, another object came loose, something brittle, curved, unmistakable. A fragment of bone, pale and fragile, resting in the dust at their feet. Panic rippled through the crew. The foreman ordered all work stopped. Police were called immediately, and within hours, the third floor was swarming with investigators. The hotel was cordoned off, and room 306 was sealed. Detectives in protective gear entered the bathroom, peeling away the plaster section by section, revealing what no one had dared to imagine. Behind the wall, in a narrow cavity that had been carefully sealed during past renovations, lay human remains. A collapsed skeleton, tangled with fabric and personal items, wedged tightly between studs and insulation. It was not the work of time or accident, it was deliberate. Someone had built it around her. The items told their own story. Along with the shoe and the locket were fragments of a blue sundress, corroded jewelry, and scraps of paper fused to the wall by years of moisture. Every piece was carefully collected, catalogued, and prepared for testing. Investigators immediately suspected what the family had long believed, that these were the remains of Lorna Reeve. But even as the evidence pointed toward her, they needed science to confirm. Samples were sent to the state lab for DNA comparison against surviving relatives. The process would take weeks, but in the meantime, detectives treated the site as an active crime scene. News of the discovery spread quickly. For local residents, it was confirmation of what many had whispered for years, that the hotel had held its secret within its walls. For Valerie, Lorna's sister, the call came late at night. She was told only that items of interest had been recovered from room 306. She didn't need details. She knew instantly what it meant. After 25 years of waiting, searching, and being dismissed, her instinct had been right. Lorna had never walked out of that hotel. She had been there all along. As police combed through the room, they reconstructed the possibilities. The cavity was large enough to conceal a body, but narrow enough that access would have required tools and knowledge of the building's structure. Whoever placed her there had done so quickly, likely in the hours immediately after her disappearance. The wall had then been resealed, and weeks later, reinforced during official renovations. To investigators, it wasn't just a hiding place, it was a cover-up. By the end of that week, the Honeysuckle Grand shut down all operations. Guests were evacuated, bookings canceled. The third floor was declared off-limits as forensic teams expanded their search to adjacent rooms. Every inch of room 306 was stripped back to its frame, exposing years of paint, plaster, and the silence that had shielded the truth. Reporters gathered outside, waiting for confirmation of what the evidence already suggested. And when Valerie drove past the building herself, she said it felt less like a hotel and more like a mausoleum. Its windows staring blankly into the woods. The walls had finally opened, and with them, a secret that had been entombed for a quarter of a century was spilling into the light. The discovery was no longer about whispers or suspicions. It was evidence. Evidence that would soon lead investigators back to the man who had always claimed his bride simply walked away. The results came back faster than anyone expected. Within weeks of the discovery, forensic analysts confirmed what many already feared. The remains hidden behind the wall in room 306 belonged to 27-year-old Lorna Reeve. The DNA matched samples taken from her sister Valerie with absolute certainty. After 25 years of questions, the mystery of her disappearance had narrowed to one grim truth. She had never left the hotel. But the forensics didn't stop there. The state medical examiner studied the skeleton with painstaking care. The fractures told a story of violence. The back of her skull had suffered a crushing blow consistent with blunt force trauma. There were no defensive wounds to the arms or legs, no signs she had tried to run. It suggested she had been attacked swiftly, without warning, inside the privacy of her honeymoon suite. Traces of fabric found near her hands told investigators she had been wearing her blue sundress at the time of death, the same one Daniel had described to police when insisting she had left for coffee. That detail struck detectives hard. For decades, Daniel's description had been accepted as fact. Now it appeared less like recollection and more like a calculated lie. What sealed the suspicion was the smallest, most damning discovery: DNA under her fingernails. Despite the years of degradation, forensic teams extracted a partial profile. When cross-checked against the national database, it matched Daniel Reeve, her husband, with over 99% certainty. It was proof she had fought back, however briefly, before her life was taken. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline with a fresh lens. The morning Daniel claimed Lorna had gone out, he told police he remained in the room until nearly 9. But records showed him absent for a 4-hour window, wandering the hotel grounds and nearby town. He said he'd left to clear his head, to calm his nerves. But forensic reconstruction suggested that window had been the opportunity he used to move her body. The wall cavity was large enough to conceal her, but narrow enough that concealment required tools and knowledge of the building's structure. Maintenance logs from 1998 showed a late-night request for special access to the hotel's utility closet on the 3rd floor. And among the surviving staff interviews, one detail emerged. A night porter remembered being tipped in cash to allow Daniel to borrow tools, though he never connected it to the disappearance at the time. The more investigators dug, the more the pieces locked into place. The hastily repainted walls, the deep carpet cleaning, the structural renovations just weeks later. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a cover-up. The evidence suggested Daniel had killed Lorna inside their room, concealed her in the wall cavity, and relied on a mix of bribery and silence to keep the secret buried. For 25 years, it had worked. He had gone on with his life, he had remarried, he had lived freely, while her family was left with nothing but unanswered questions. Detectives brought the findings to Valerie first. She listened quietly as they explained the science, the timelines, the DNA. When they finished, she asked only one question. So it was him. The lead investigator answered yes. For Valerie, it was both vindication and devastation. She had spent half her life insisting her sister hadn't just walked away, that Daniel's story didn't fit. Now she knew she had been right all along. But being right meant acknowledging the horror of what had truly happened, and that weight was almost unbearable. From a legal standpoint, the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA under her nails was the strongest link. The blunt force trauma confirmed a violent death. The access to tools in the 4-hour gap gave motive and means. Prosecutors prepared to move forward with charges, confident they finally had the case they had lacked in 1998. But what struck investigators most was not just the science. It was the silence that had surrounded the truth for so long. Hotel staff who had looked the other way, records that had been misplaced. A system that had allowed suspicion to wither without proof. The forensics didn't just expose the crime, they exposed the years of failure that had let it hide. In the weeks after the confirmation, room 306 was sealed off once again. The locket, the dress, and the broken shoe were displayed briefly to the family before being held as evidence. Valerie clutched the locket, wiping away years of tarnish until the photo of her sister shone through faintly once more. She said she could almost hear her sister's voice, almost feel her presence, as if the walls themselves had been holding her story in silence all that time. For the investigators, the case had shifted from mystery to accountability. The science had spoken clearly, and its voice pointed in one direction. The only question left was what Daniel Reeve would say when confronted with the truth that had been hidden, literally, inside the walls of the Honeysuckle Grand. When detectives finally knocked on Daniel Reeve's front door in the fall of 2023, he was living a quiet suburban life in New Hampshire. He had remarried nearly 2 decades earlier, raised stepchildren, and built a reputation in his neighborhood as a calm, dependable man. His second wife told reporters later that she had never once suspected anything about his past beyond the story she knew, that his first wife had disappeared tragically on their honeymoon. But when investigators explained what had been found in the walls of room 306, her world unraveled in an instant. Daniel was placed in handcuffs, escorted past a row of stunned neighbors, and taken into custody. For the first time in 25 years, he was forced to face the truth he had buried. Inside the interrogation room, Daniel tried at first to hold his composure. He denied everything, insisting the evidence must be a mistake, that the DNA could have been transferred innocently, that he hadn't touched her that morning. But as investigators laid out the forensics, piece by piece, the blunt force trauma, the DNA under her nails, the tool access logs, the renovations filed weeks after her disappearance, his facade began to crack. Hours into questioning, he asked for water, held the cup so tightly his knuckles whitened, and finally lowered his head. The breakdown came not in shouts or anger, but in a stream of muttered words, the kind that come from someone who has carried a weight too heavy for too long. According to his confession, the marriage had soured almost immediately after the wedding. Lorna had expressed doubts before they even boarded the plane to Vermont. He claimed she had threatened to leave him that night in the hotel room, to call her sister and admit she had made a mistake. He described her words as a humiliation he couldn't bear. He said the argument turned physical, that she struck him first, that she wouldn't stop. But the evidence told a different story. The absence of defensive wounds, the angle of the head fracture, the partial DNA profile beneath her fingernails, everything pointed not to self-defense, but to a sudden act of violence carried out in anger. His claim of provocation didn't match the forensic reality. Once she was dead, Daniel panicked. He admitted pacing the room, considering leaving her body there, but terrified of what it would mean. He said he remembered the maintenance closet near the stairwell, remembered the night porter who worked for tips, and realized he could get tools if he offered enough cash. He convinced the porter to look the other way, borrowing a hammer, crowbar, and flashlight. In the early hours, while other guests slept, he pulled apart the bathroom wall, stuffed her body inside, and sealed it as best he could. By sunrise, he was already rehearsing the story he would give to the police, that his wife had walked out early for coffee and never returned. What disturbed investigators most was not only Daniel's confession, but the extent of the silence that had followed. When questioned about the hotel's unusual cooperation back in 1998, Daniel hesitated. Then he admitted he had not been the only one protecting himself. At the time, the hotel's owner was a man with a history of financial trouble and prior charges for bribery. Daniel said he suspected the owner had quickly realized a scandal tied to the hotel could ruin the business. Rather than risk it, management repainted the walls, changed the locks, and provided only selective information to police. Whether money had changed hands or simply favors had been traded, the result was the same. Silence. Silence that allowed a killer to walk free. For prosecutors, the case was airtight. They had physical evidence, DNA, and a confession. But for Lorna's family, the details of how it had been concealed were nearly as painful as the murder itself. Valerie learned that her sister had been only feet away all along, hidden not by mystery but by lies. She called it a burial in plain sight, a cover-up that had turned grief into decades of torment. When asked if she felt relief, she shook her head. Relief, she said, doesn't come when you realize how easily the truth could have been found if people had simply chosen to look harder or chosen not to protect their own interests. Daniel was charged with second-degree murder, obstruction, and evidence tampering. As he awaited trial, reporters pressed for more details about the hotel's involvement, about the owner's past, about why no one had spoken sooner. But most of those questions went unanswered. The owner had died years earlier. Staff had scattered. The paper trail was thin. What remained was the story of a man who killed his wife, hid her body inside a wall, and relied on silence to carry him into another life. For a quarter of a century, it worked. But secrets like that do not stay buried forever. And when the walls of room 306 finally opened, so did the truth. The funeral was small, private, and quiet, just as Lorna's family wanted it. After 25 years of not knowing, they finally had her back, though what they were given was only fragments of a life cut short. Her remains were laid in a simple casket, draped in flowers, surrounded by photographs of a young woman who had once believed her future was just beginning. Valerie spoke briefly at the service. She didn't linger on anger or the years of torment. Instead, she told the truth plainly. She never left. She was there the whole time. The words echoed in the church like a final answer to a question that had haunted them for decades. Lorna's parents, now elderly, held each other in silence. For them, time had stolen too much already. Closure felt less like relief and more like surrender. In Vermont, the aftermath spread far beyond the family. The honeysuckle grand, once a landmark of rustic elegance, could not survive the scandal. Bookings were canceled, lawsuits mounted, and within months the new owners announced its permanent closure. For the town, it was an ending they had seen coming long before the truth came out. The hotel had always carried whispers, a reputation it couldn't escape. But now the whispers were replaced with headlines. Guests no longer talked about faint crying in the walls or the strange feeling of being watched in room 306. They talked about a woman murdered on her honeymoon, hidden in the very structure of the building, while staff and management looked the other way. The Honeysuckle Grand wasn't a hotel anymore. It was a crime scene. Room 306 was the first to go. Demolition crews arrived under police supervision, tearing down the very walls that had entombed her. The cavity where her body had been hidden was exposed one last time before it was reduced to rubble. For some of the officers present, it was symbolic, an act of dismantling the silence that had protected Daniel Reeve for so long. But for others, it was sickening to realize how close investigators had been in 1998, how easily the truth could have been discovered if anyone had questioned why the walls were rebuilt so quickly. Standing among the debris, one detective later admitted it was the most haunting moment of his career. Not because of what they found, but because of how long it had been there, in plain sight, ignored. National media seized on the story, framing it as more than just a true crime case. It became an example of how privilege, manipulation, and silence could bury the truth for decades. Questions were raised about the original investigation. Why had the staff not been pressed harder? Why were renovations allowed without scrutiny? Why did a maid's statement about hearing a fight vanish from the record? The answers pointed to a mix of incompetence and quiet collusion. A hotel protecting its business, a suspect protecting himself, a system that let suspicion fade when the evidence seemed too thin. In the end, the cover-up had worked, for a time. Daniel had remarried, lived freely, built a new life, and all the while, the woman he swore had walked out on him remained a few feet away, behind plaster and paint, waiting. For Valerie, the media attention was secondary. What mattered was that her sister was no longer just a missing person, no longer a question mark frozen in time. She was a victim whose story had finally been told in full. Valerie often repeated one line to reporters who asked how she felt. The walls spoke for her. They told the truth he tried to erase. It was both a condemnation of Daniel and a reminder of the silence that had allowed him to escape justice for so long. She didn't speak of forgiveness. She didn't speak of peace. She spoke only of truth and how hard her family had fought to reach it. As the trial date for Daniel approached, public interest swelled. But for many who followed the case, the verdict hardly mattered. The discovery itself was enough to confirm what people had long suspected. The idea that someone could be killed, hidden, and forgotten inside the walls of a building for a quarter of a century shocked the nation. It forced uncomfortable questions about how many other secrets might remain sealed behind silence, how many other cases might be waiting for their own walls to open. The Honeysuckle Grand stood empty for a short while, windows boarded, weeds overtaking the grounds. Eventually, it was purchased by developers who promised to build something new on the site. But locals say the land feels different now. Not haunted, not cursed, just heavy with the knowledge of what it held for so long. Where travelers once checked in for honeymoons and summer holidays, a woman had been entombed while life carried on around her. That reality was not easily forgotten. In the end, Lorna's story became more than a case file. It became a warning, a reminder that sometimes the truth isn't buried deep underground or lost in the wilderness. Sometimes it is right in front of us, disguised by paint and silence, waiting for someone to finally break through the wall and listen.